Welcome. Tonight we travel back in time to the world of ancient Greece, a land of bright sunlight, quiet villages, stone temples, and peaceful coastal towns along the Mediterranean Sea. More than 2,000 years ago, people across Greece lived in small communities surrounded by mountains, olive groves, and the calm blue waters of the sea. White stone buildings stood along narrow streets while farmers worked in nearby fields growing olives, grapes, and grain. Fishing boats moved slowly across the water while merchants traveled between islands and coastal cities. Daily life in ancient Greece followed a steady rhythm shaped by nature, trade, and community. Tonight we will gently explore what life may have been like in this ancient world. From the first quiet moments of morning to the calm stillness of night, we will follow the peaceful rhythm of daily life in ancient Greece. Morning in a Greek village. Morning begins as sunlight spreads across the hills and coastline. Small villages slowly wake as families begin their day. Homes built from stone and clay stand close together along narrow paths. Roofs made from clay tiles protect the houses from the warm Mediterranean sun. Inside these homes, families prepare simple meals of bread, olives, cheese, and fruit. Outside, farmers gather tools before walking toward nearby fields. Some villagers head toward olive groves where trees have grown for generations. Others prepare fishing boats along the shoreline. As the sun rises higher in the sky, the quiet village begins another day of work and life. Farming along the rivers. The rivers of Mesopotamia made farming possible in a region that would otherwise be dry and difficult for agriculture. Farmers built irrigation canals that carried water from the rivers into their fields. These canals allowed crops to grow even during long dry seasons. Barley was one of the most important crops grown in Mesopotamia. Wheat, vegetables, and date palms were also common. Farmers used simple plows pulled by animals to prepare the soil. Planting and harvesting required many hours of work under the hot sun. Because farming depended on careful water management, communities often worked together to maintain irrigation systems. These canals allowed cities and villages to survive and grow along the rivers. The marketplace. Markets were some of the busiest places in Mesopotamian cities. Farmers arrived carrying baskets of grain, vegetables, and fruit. Fishermen brought fish caught from the rivers. Craftsmen sold pottery, tools, woven baskets, and cloth. Merchants sometimes traveled long distances between cities bringing goods from other regions. Spices, metals, and rare materials were traded across these early trade networks. The marketplace was not only a place to buy and sell goods but also a social gathering place where people shared news and conversation. Throughout the day the market remained lively with voices, movement, and trade. Life along the Tigris and Euphrates. The land of Mesopotamia depended heavily on two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These rivers flowed down from distant mountains and across the wide plains where early cities formed. Unlike some rivers that flooded gently each year, the Tigris and Euphrates could be unpredictable. Floods sometimes came suddenly, damaging fields or villages built too close to the riverbanks. Because of this, early Mesopotamian farmers developed irrigation systems to control the water. They dug canals that carried river water across the land and into their fields. These canals allowed crops to grow even during dry seasons. Farmers worked together to maintain these irrigation channels. If the canals became blocked with mud or debris, the water would stop flowing and crops could fail. Because farming depended on careful water management, cooperation between neighbors was essential. Over time, these irrigation systems allowed entire cities to grow in what would otherwise have been dry and difficult land. The steady movement of water through canals became one of the defining features of life in Mesopotamia. Mud brick homes. Most homes in Mesopotamia were built from mud bricks. Stone and wood were rare resources in the region, but clay from the rivers was plentiful. Workers shaped wet clay into rectangular bricks and left them in the sun to dry. Once hardened, these bricks could be stacked together to form walls. Homes were usually simple rectangular structures with flat roofs. Many houses were built around a small open courtyard in the center. This courtyard allowed fresh air and sunlight to enter the home. Rooms opened into the courtyard where families cooked, worked, and rested. Inside the house, floors were often made from packed earth or clay. Furniture was simple. Families used woven mats, wooden stools, and clay storage jars. Although the homes were modest, they provided shelter from the heat of the sun and the dust of the work of Mesopotamian farmers. Farming was the foundation of Mesopotamian life. Most people living in the region worked the land growing crops that supported both villages and cities. Barley was one of the most common crops grown in Mesopotamia. It grew well in the hot climate and became a major food source. Farmers also grew wheat, onions, beans, and lentils. Date palm trees were especially valuable. Dates could be eaten fresh, dried for storage, or used to produce sweet syrups. Farmers worked long hours preparing fields, planting seeds, and harvesting crops. Simple wooden plows pulled by oxen helped break the soil before planting. Although the work was demanding, successful harvests allowed cities to grow and trade with other regions. The rhythm of farming shaped the daily lives of many people across Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian marketplace. Markets were lively gathering places inside Mesopotamian cities. Merchants arranged goods along wooden stalls while buyers walked between them searching for supplies. Farmers brought baskets filled with grain, vegetables, and dates. Potters sold clay jars used for cooking and storage. Weavers offered cloth made from wool gathered from sheep raised in the countryside. Fish caught from the rivers were also sold in the markets. Trade did not always use coins. In many cases, goods were exchanged directly. Barley itself sometimes served as a form of payment. The marketplace also allowed people to share news and stories. Travelers arriving from distant cities often brought information about events happening far beyond the local community. Becoming a scribe required years of training. Students practiced writing the many symbols used in cuneiform. Because writing was a specialized skill, scribes held respected positions within Mesopotamian society. Their careful records allowed governments, merchants, and temples to organize complex systems of trade and administration. The ziggurat. The most impressive structures in Mesopotamian cities were the ziggurats. These massive temple towers rose high above the surrounding buildings. A ziggurat was built using layers of mud bricks stacked into a stepped pyramid shape. Wide staircases allowed priests and temple workers to climb to the upper levels. At the top of the structure stood a temple dedicated to a specific god. People believed that the gods watched over the city from these sacred spaces. Because of their size and importance, ziggurats became the center of religious life. They could be seen from great distances, rising above the flat plains surrounding the city. Boats on the rivers. The rivers of Mesopotamia were not only important for farming but also served as major routes for travel and trade. Long wooden boats moved slowly along the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, carrying goods between cities. Merchants loaded their boats with grain, pottery, cloth, and baskets of dates. Because roads across the dry plains could be difficult to travel, moving goods by water was often easier. Some boats were small fishing vessels used by villagers who lived along the riverbanks. Others were larger cargo boats designed to carry heavy supplies. The gentle movement of boats drifting along the rivers became a familiar sight in Mesopotamian life. These waterways connected distant cities and allowed trade to flourish across the region. Pottery and everyday tools. Pottery was one of the most common crafts in Mesopotamian cities. Clay taken from riverbanks was shaped into bowls, jars, plates, and storage containers. Potters worked carefully at spinning wheels that allowed them to form smooth shapes. Once shaped, the clay vessels were dried and then fired inside hot kilns. This heating process hardened the clay into durable pottery. These containers were used to store grain, oil, water, and many other goods. Pottery also allowed merchants to transport products safely between cities. Because clay was abundant in Mesopotamia, pottery became an essential part of daily life. The role of temples. Temples played a central role in Mesopotamian cities. These religious centers were often located near the base of the Great Ziggurat. Priests and temple workers carried out ceremonies meant to honor the gods believed to protect the city. Temples were also important economic centers. They stored grain, managed farmland, and organized workers. Many people brought offerings such as food or animals to the temple as gifts to the gods. These offerings were believed to maintain harmony between the people and the divine forces watching over their city. Because of this, temples held both spiritual and practical importance in Mesopotamian society. Animals of the river plains. Animals were an important part of daily life in Mesopotamia. Farmers raised sheep, goats, and cattle that provided food, wool, and leather. Donkeys were commonly used to carry goods along trade routes between cities. Oxen helped pull plows through farmland during planting season. Along the rivers, fishermen caught fish using nets or simple hooks. Birds often gathered near the water while wild animals roamed the distant plains. These animals helped support farming, trade, and survival in the region. Evening in the city. As the sun begins to set across the plains, the busy streets of the city gradually become quieter. Merchants close their market stalls and gather their goods. Farmers return from fields carrying tools and baskets. Cooking fires are lit inside homes as families prepare evening meals. The warm glow of oil lamps begins to appear along narrow streets. Conversations fade as people gather inside their homes to rest after the day's work. The quiet of the Mesopotamian night. Eventually the city grows calm beneath the night sky. The great ziggurat stands silently above the rooftops. The rivers continue flowing slowly beside the city walls. Most of the residents sleep while only a few guards remain awake. Torches flicker softly along the streets and temple courtyards. For a few peaceful hours, the ancient city rests before the first light of morning arrives once again. Irrigation and the control of water. One of the greatest achievements of the people living in ancient Mesopotamia was their ability to control water. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was fertile, but it could also be harsh. Rainfall in the region was often unpredictable, and without help the soil could quickly become dry. To solve this problem, early farmers developed large systems of irrigation canals. These canals carried river water across the plains and into the surrounding farmland. Workers dug long channels into the earth, guiding water away from the river and toward their crops. Smaller branches of the canals carried water into individual fields where it could soak into the soil. Maintaining these irrigation systems required constant work. Canals could fill with mud or debris after heavy floods. When this happened, farmers and laborers gathered together to clear the channels so the water could flow again. Because irrigation required cooperation, entire communities often worked together to manage the water supply. This shared responsibility helped villages and cities grow larger over time. Without these irrigation canals, the fields of Mesopotamia would not have been able to support the large populations that eventually developed along the rivers. The growth of Mesopotamian cities. Over time, small farming villages began to grow into larger settlements. As agriculture became more productive, people no longer needed to spend all of their time growing food. Some individuals became craftsmen, merchants, priests, or administrators. These specialized roles helped cities expand and become more organized. Cities such as Uruk, and Babylon became important centers of trade and culture. Within these cities, buildings stood close together along winding streets. Markets, temples, homes, and workshops filled the crowded urban spaces. City walls were sometimes built to protect residents from outside threats. Inside these walls, thousands of people could live and work together. These early cities became some of the first large urban centers in human history. Their growth marked an important step in the development of complex societies. The work of craftsmen. Not everyone in Mesopotamia worked as a farmer. Many people developed specialized skills that allowed them to create useful objects for the community. Craftsmen worked with clay, metal, stone, and textiles to produce tools, containers, and decorative items. Potters shaped clay into bowls, jars, and storage vessels used throughout daily life. Metalworkers used copper and bronze to produce knives, tools, and weapons. Weavers created cloth from wool gathered from sheep raised in the countryside. These fabrics were used to make clothing and blankets. Craftsmen often worked in small workshops located near the marketplaces of the city. The products they created were traded locally and sometimes transported to distant cities through trade networks. Their work helped support the growing economies of Mesopotamian cities. Trade across the ancient world. Trade played an important role in Mesopotamian society. Although the region had fertile soil for farming, it lacked certain natural resources such as stone, timber, and metal ores. To obtain these materials, merchants traveled long distances to trade with neighboring regions. Caravans of donkeys carried goods across deserts and plains. Boats transported cargo along the rivers and across the Persian Gulf. Mesopotamian merchants exchanged grain, textiles, and crafted goods for materials such as copper, tin, and precious stones. These trade routes connected Mesopotamia with distant lands including Anatolia, the Indus Valley, and regions along the Mediterranean. Through trade, ideas and technologies also spread between cultures. This exchange helped shape the development of early civilizations. Schools and the training of scribes. Learning to write in Mesopotamia required patience and years of study. Young students training to become scribes attended special schools often connected to temples or government buildings. There, teachers instructed them in the complex system of cuneiform writing. Students practiced pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets using a stylus made from a reed. They copied lists of symbols, words, and sentences over and over again until they mastered the writing system. Training could take many years, but those who succeeded gained an important role in society. Scribes recorded laws, business transactions, religious texts, and historical events. Their work allowed governments and temples to keep detailed records. Because writing was such a valuable skill, scribes were often respected members of Mesopotamian society. The rhythm of life in Mesopotamia. Life in ancient Mesopotamia followed a steady rhythm shaped by nature and daily work. Farmers rose early to tend their fields and irrigation canals. Merchants opened their stalls in the markets as the city slowly filled with activity. Craftsmen worked in their shops producing tools, pottery, and cloth. Priests performed rituals in temples while scribes recorded information on clay tablets. As the sun moved across the sky, the city remained busy with movement and trade. Then, as evening approached, the pace of life gradually slowed. Families gathered inside their homes to share meals and rest after long hours of work. The cycle of work, trade, and rest repeated day after day. This rhythm shaped the lives of the people who lived in the cities and villages of ancient Mesopotamia. Clay and the building of cities. One of the most important materials in Mesopotamia was something very simple: clay. The rivers that flowed through the region carried rich mud along their banks. When this mud dried, it could be shaped into strong building materials. Workers gathered clay from the riverbanks and mixed it with water and straw. This mixture was pressed into wooden molds to form bricks. These bricks were then left in the sun to dry and harden. Because wood and stone were scarce in Mesopotamia, these mud bricks became the main material used to build homes, walls, and temples. Entire cities were constructed from these sun-dried bricks. Large buildings sometimes used bricks that were baked in ovens to make them even stronger. Although these structures required occasional repairs after heavy rains, they allowed cities to grow quickly across the river plains. The simple material of clay helped support some of the earliest cities in human history. The role of the king. Mesopotamian cities were often ruled by powerful kings. These rulers were responsible for maintaining order, protecting the city, and overseeing important projects such as irrigation canals and city walls. Kings also worked closely with temple leaders, since religion played an important role in Mesopotamian society. Many kings believed their authority came from the gods. They often ordered the construction of large temples and monuments to honor these divine powers. Some kings also created written laws that helped organize society. One of the most famous examples was the Code of Hammurabi, a collection of laws carved into stone. These laws addressed many aspects of daily life, including trade, property, and family relationships. Through leadership, law, and construction projects, Mesopotamian kings shaped the development of their cities. Clothing in Mesopotamia. Clothing in ancient Mesopotamia was usually simple and practical. Most garments were made from wool, which came from sheep raised in the surrounding countryside. Weavers spun the wool into thread and then used looms to create fabric. Clothing was often wrapped or draped around the body rather than sewn into complex shapes. Men commonly wore skirts or robes that reached the knees or ankles. Women wore longer garments that covered most of the body. The quality of clothing sometimes showed a person's social status. Wealthier individuals could afford finer fabrics and more decorative clothing. In the hot climate of Mesopotamia, loose garments helped people stay cool while working or walking through the city streets. Food and daily meals. The daily meals of Mesopotamian families were based largely on grains. Barley was one of the most important crops, and was used to make bread and porridge. Bread was eaten with many meals and sometimes served with vegetables, dates, or small portions of meat. Fish caught from the rivers also provided an important food source. Date palms growing along the riverbanks produced sweet fruit that could be eaten fresh or dried. Dates were sometimes used to make syrups or sweet drinks. Meals were often prepared using clay pots placed over small fires. Families gathered together to eat and share conversation after long hours of work. Although the meals were simple by modern standards, they provided the energy needed for daily life in the hot river plains. Transportation across the plains. Travel across Mesopotamia could be difficult. The land was mostly flat and dry, with few paved roads. Most travel happened on dirt paths that connected cities and villages. Donkeys were commonly used to carry goods and supplies along these routes. Merchants loaded their animals with baskets filled with grain, pottery, or textiles. These caravans slowly moved between cities, sometimes traveling for days across open plains. River travel was often easier than traveling by land. Boats drifting along the Tigris and Euphrates allowed merchants to transport larger amounts of goods. Together, these land and water routes helped connect Mesopotamian communities with distant regions. Evening along the rivers. As the sun begins to set, the rivers of Mesopotamia reflect the warm colors of the evening sky. Boats slowly return toward the city docks after a day of travel or fishing. Farmers finish their work in the fields and begin walking back toward their homes. Inside the city, cooking fires are lit as families prepare their evening meals. The busy sounds of the marketplace gradually fade as merchants close their stalls. Oil lamps begin to glow softly inside homes and along the streets. The great ziggurat rises quietly above the rooftops as darkness slowly settles across the land. Another peaceful night begins in the cities and villages of ancient Mesopotamia. Writing and record keeping. One of the most important inventions of ancient Mesopotamia was the development of writing. The earliest form of writing used in the region was called cuneiform. Instead of writing on paper or parchment, scribes used small clay tablets. They pressed wedge-shaped marks into the soft clay using a pointed reed stylus. Once the tablet dried in the sun, the writing became permanent. These tablets were used to record many different types of information. Some contained lists of goods being traded in the marketplace. Others recorded laws, business agreements, or government records. Temples and palaces stored thousands of these clay tablets. Because of this system of writing, historians today have been able to learn a great deal about life in ancient Mesopotamia. The work of builders. Building large structures in Mesopotamian cities required the efforts of many workers. Laborers carried mud bricks, mixed clay, and stacked materials to form walls and buildings. Because the region lacked large forests, wood was used sparingly. Instead, construction depended heavily on sun-dried bricks made from clay. Workers used simple ramps and scaffolding to raise walls higher as buildings grew. Important structures such as temples, palaces, and city walls required thousands of bricks. Repairing buildings was also a constant task. Heavy rains or floods could weaken mud brick structures, so workers regularly strengthened walls with fresh layers of clay. Through this continuous effort, Mesopotamian cities slowly expanded across the plains. The importance of date palms. Among the many plants growing in Mesopotamia, the date palm tree was one of the most valuable. These tall trees thrived along the riverbanks where the soil remained fertile. Date palms provided food, shade, and useful materials. The fruit produced by these trees was sweet and could be eaten fresh or dried for storage. Dates were also used to create syrups and sweet drinks. The leaves of the palm tree could be woven into baskets, mats, and roofing materials. Even the wood from the tree could be used in construction. Because of these many uses, date palms were often carefully protected and cultivated. They became an important part of life for people living along the rivers. Religion and the gods. Religion played a central role in Mesopotamian society. People believed that powerful gods controlled the forces of nature. These gods were thought to influence floods, storms, harvests, and the success of cities. Temples dedicated to these gods stood at the center of many cities. Priests performed rituals and offered gifts such as food, animals, or valuable objects. These offerings were meant to gain the favor of the gods and ensure the well-being of the community. Large festivals were sometimes held to honor specific deities. During these events, music, ceremonies, and gatherings brought people together in celebration. Religion helped shape many aspects of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. The work of fishermen. The rivers flowing through Mesopotamia were filled with fish. Because of this, fishing became an important source of food for many communities. Fishermen used nets, traps, and simple hooks to catch fish from the water. Some fished from small boats while others worked along the riverbanks. Fresh fish could be cooked immediately or preserved by drying in the sun. Fishing helped supplement the diets of many families living near the rivers. The steady presence of fishermen along the water became a familiar part of daily life in Mesopotamia. Nightfall over the plains. As evening settles across the plains of Mesopotamia, the cities and villages begin to quiet. The last merchants gather their goods from the marketplace. Farmers finish their work in the fields and return home along dusty paths. Cooking fires glow softly inside mud brick homes. Oil lamps illuminate small rooms where families share meals and conversation. Outside the city, the rivers continue their slow movement through the land. Above the rooftops, the towering ziggurat stands silent beneath the night sky. For a few peaceful hours, the busy world of ancient Mesopotamia rests in calm silence. The work of weavers. In ancient Mesopotamia, weaving cloth was an important craft that supported daily life. Most clothing was made from wool gathered from sheep raised in the countryside. After sheep were sheared, the wool was cleaned and spun into thread using simple spinning tools. This thread was then woven into fabric using wooden looms. Weavers worked carefully, guiding threads across the loom to create strong cloth. The finished fabric could be used to make clothing, blankets, and other useful items. In some cities, weaving workshops employed many workers who produced cloth for trade. These fabrics were sometimes exchanged with distant regions through trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to other civilizations. Music and entertainment. Although life in Mesopotamia required hard work, people still found time for music and entertainment. Musicians played instruments such as harps, flutes, and drums. These instruments were often used during festivals, religious ceremonies, and celebrations. Storytelling was also a popular form of entertainment. Travelers and storytellers shared tales about heroes, gods, and distant lands. Some of these stories were eventually written down on clay tablets. One famous example is the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature. Through music and storytelling, people in Mesopotamia passed down traditions and cultural knowledge across generations. The city walls. Many Mesopotamian cities were protected by large city walls. These walls were built from layers of mud brick and sometimes reinforced with towers. Their purpose was to protect the city from potential attackers. Building these walls required enormous effort. Workers carried thousands of bricks and carefully stacked them into strong barriers. Gates built into the walls allowed travelers and merchants to enter the city. Guards stationed at these gates monitored who came and went. These walls symbolized the strength and independence of the city they protected. A calm night in Mesopotamia. As the sun disappears beyond the horizon, the land slowly grows quiet. The marketplace is empty and the streets become calm. Families gather inside their homes after long days of work. Oil lamps cast soft light across clay walls and woven mats. Outside the city, the rivers continue flowing steadily through the dark plains. The towering ziggurat rises silently above the sleeping city. Under the stars, ancient Mesopotamia rests until the first light of morning returns once again. The work of metalworkers. Although clay was the most common material used in Mesopotamia, metal was also very important. Metalworkers created tools, weapons, and decorative objects using metals such as copper and bronze. These materials were not always found locally, so they were often obtained through trade with distant regions. Once the metal arrived in the city, skilled craftsmen heated it in furnaces until it became soft enough to shape. Using hammers and molds, they formed knives, farming tools, spearheads, and other useful objects. Metal tools made farming and construction easier than before. Because of this, metalworkers played an important role in the development of Mesopotamian cities. Their workshops were often filled with the sound of hammering metal and the glow of hot furnaces. The work of shepherds. Outside the cities, shepherds guided flocks of sheep and goats across the open plains. These animals provided wool, milk, and meat that supported many communities. Shepherds often spent long days watching over their animals as they grazed on grasses growing along riverbanks and fields. Using staffs and simple tools, they guided the animals from place to place. Sheep were especially valuable because their wool could be spun into thread and woven into cloth. At night, shepherds sometimes gathered their flocks into fenced areas to protect them from predators. The quiet life of shepherds played an important role in supplying resources to Mesopotamian society. Boats and river travel. The rivers of Mesopotamia served as major highways for travel and trade. Boats moved slowly along the water carrying people and goods between cities. Some boats were small fishing vessels used by villagers living along the river banks. Others were larger cargo boats capable of transporting heavy loads. Merchants used these boats to move grain, pottery, textiles, and other products from one city to another. The steady flow of river traffic helped connect the many communities spread across the region. Because of the rivers, distant cities could communicate and trade more easily than if they had relied only on land travel. The life of children. Children growing up in Mesopotamian cities and villages learned many of the skills needed for adult life. Young boys often helped their fathers with farming, trade, or craft work. Girls sometimes learned household tasks such as preparing food, weaving cloth, and caring for younger family members. Some children from wealthier families attended schools where they trained to become scribes. These students spent many hours practicing writing symbols into clay tablets. Although life could involve responsibilities from a young age, children still found time to play games and explore their surroundings. Growing up in Mesopotamia meant gradually learning the skills that kept the community functioning. Festivals and celebrations. Throughout the year, Mesopotamian cities celebrated festivals that honored their gods and traditions. These festivals often included music, ceremonies, and large gatherings of people. Priests performed rituals in temples while musicians played instruments such as harps and drums. Food and drink were shared as people celebrated together. Some festivals marked important seasonal changes such as planting or harvest times. Others honored specific gods believed to protect the city. These celebrations allowed communities to come together and strengthen their shared traditions. The stillness of the late night. As night grows deeper, the city becomes quieter. The busy sounds of the day fade away. Most people sleep inside their mud brick homes after long hours of work. Only a few guards remain awake, watching over the city streets and temple grounds. The rivers continue flowing slowly through the dark landscape. Above the city, the stars shine clearly across the open sky. For a short time, the ancient land of Mesopotamia rests peacefully beneath the quiet night. The work of brick makers. Because most buildings in Mesopotamia were made from mud brick, brick makers were essential workers in every city. Their work began along the riverbanks where clay was plentiful. Workers mixed clay with water and chopped straw to create a thick, moldable mixture. This mixture was then pressed into wooden molds shaped like bricks. After being removed from the molds, the bricks were left out in the hot sun to dry. The powerful Mesopotamian sun hardened the bricks over several days. Once dry, these bricks were stacked and transported to construction sites where homes, walls, and temples were built. Large building projects required thousands of bricks, meaning brick makers worked continuously to supply the growing cities. Without their efforts, the cities of Mesopotamia could never have expanded across the plains. Life along the riverbanks. The riverbanks of the Tigris and Euphrates were among the most active places in Mesopotamia. Here, fishermen prepared their nets while merchants loaded cargo onto boats. Farmers guided water from the rivers into nearby irrigation canals. Tall reeds grew along the edges of the water and were often harvested to make baskets, mats, and simple boats. These riverbanks provided not only water but also valuable materials used in daily life. The movement of people, animals, and boats made the riversides busy places throughout the day. Yet despite the activity, the steady flow of the rivers created a calm and predictable rhythm for those who lived nearby. The work of potters. Potters were among the most skilled craftsmen in Mesopotamian society. Using clay from the riverbanks, they created containers used in homes, markets, and temples. The potter's wheel allowed them to shape spinning clay into smooth bowls, jars, and storage vessels. Once formed, the pottery pieces were left to dry before being placed in a hot kiln. The heat of the kiln hardened the clay into strong ceramic containers. These jars were used to store grain, oil, water, and other goods. Because pottery was durable and practical, it became one of the most common items found in Mesopotamian households. The temple courtyard. At the center of many Mesopotamian cities stood large temple complexes. These sacred spaces were often located beside the towering ziggurat. Inside the temple courtyard, priests and temple workers carried out daily rituals. Offerings of food, animals, and precious objects were presented to the gods. People visiting the temple sometimes came to pray, seek guidance, or bring gifts. The courtyard itself was usually a wide open space surrounded by stone or mud brick walls. Although the temples were important religious centers, they also functioned as places where communities gathered for ceremonies and festivals. The presence of the temple reminded everyone of the strong connection between religion and daily life in Mesopotamia. Evening work in the fields. As the sun began to lower toward the horizon, farmers finished their final tasks in the fields. Tools were gathered and irrigation channels were checked to ensure water continued flowing properly. Oxen that had helped pull plows were led back toward shelters for the night. Farmers often walked home together along dusty paths that connected the farmland to nearby villages. The heat of the day slowly faded as cooler evening air spread across the plains. This quiet moment at the end of the workday gave farmers time to reflect on the tasks they had completed and prepare for the following day. The calm of the Mesopotamian night. As darkness spreads across the land, the cities of Mesopotamia grow still. The bustling markets and busy streets fall silent. Families rest inside their homes after long hours of work. Oil lamps glow softly within mud brick rooms while the distant sound of the river continues through the night. High above the rooftops, the ziggurat stands quietly against the starlit sky. For a few peaceful hours, the ancient world sleeps beneath the calm night. The work of donkey caravans. Across the dry plains surrounding Mesopotamian cities, long lines of donkeys could often be seen traveling slowly along dusty paths. These animals were extremely important for transportation. Merchants loaded baskets and sacks onto the backs of donkeys, allowing goods to be carried across long distances. Grain, pottery, textiles, and metal tools were among the many items transported this way. Caravans sometimes traveled between distant cities, moving along trade routes that crossed deserts and river valleys. The journeys could take many days. Traveling together in caravans helped merchants protect their goods and support one another during the long trip. The steady movement of donkey caravans helped connect Mesopotamian cities with neighboring regions. Clay lamps and light. As evening approached, homes and streets in Mesopotamian cities were illuminated by small oil lamps. These lamps were usually made from clay and filled with oil, often produced from plants or seeds. A small wick placed inside the oil could be lit to produce a steady flame. The light from these lamps was soft and gentle. Inside homes, lamps allowed families to prepare food, talk, and complete small tasks even after the sun had set. Lamps were also used in temples, workshops, and marketplaces during the darker hours. Although simple, these small clay lamps helped extend daily activity into the evening. The storage of grain. Grain was one of the most valuable resources in Mesopotamia. Because farming depended on seasonal harvests, large quantities of grain had to be stored carefully. Granaries were built to hold barley and wheat gathered from the fields. These storage buildings were often raised slightly above the ground to keep the grain dry. Workers monitored the grain to protect it from moisture or pests. Stored grain helped ensure that communities had food even during seasons when crops were not growing. It also served as a form of wealth and trade. Managing these supplies was an important responsibility for city officials and temple administrators. The life of fishermen. The rivers that ran through Mesopotamia provided an abundant supply of fish. For many people living near the water, fishing became a regular part of daily life. Fishermen used nets, traps, and simple hooks to catch fish from the rivers. Some worked from small wooden boats while others fished from the riverbanks. Once caught, the fish could be cooked fresh or preserved by drying in the sun. Fish helped provide an important source of protein in the diets of Mesopotamian communities. The quiet work of fishermen along the riverbanks added another layer to the daily rhythm of life in the region. The final quiet hours. As the night grows deeper, Mesopotamian cities settle into stillness. The busy sounds of the day fade completely. Merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and scribes all rest inside their homes. Only the gentle flow of the rivers continues through the dark plains. The great temples and ziggurats stand silent beneath the stars. Soon the first light of morning will appear again, and the cycle of life in ancient Mesopotamia will begin once more. The work of merchants. Merchants played an important role in Mesopotamian cities. While farmers grew crops and craftsmen produced tools and goods, merchants helped move these products from one place to another. In the marketplaces of cities such as Ur and Babylon, merchants arranged their goods on tables and mats for buyers to examine. Some sold pottery, cloth, and metal tools. Others traded food such as grain, dates, and dried fish. Many merchants traveled long distances between cities. They often joined caravans for safety while transporting goods across the plains. Because of these merchants, products from one region could reach people living many miles away. Their work helped strengthen connections between the many communities of Mesopotamia. The work of bakers and brewers. Grain harvested from Mesopotamian fields was used in many ways. Two important professions developed around this grain: bakers and brewers. Bakers ground barley into flour and mixed it with water to create dough. This dough was shaped into loaves and baked in clay ovens heated with fire. Bread became a basic food eaten by nearly everyone. Brewers also used barley to produce one of the most common drinks in Mesopotamia: beer. Barley was soaked, fermented, and turned into a thick drink that was often consumed during meals. Because clean water was not always easy to store, beer sometimes served as a safer drink. Both bread and beer were central parts of daily life in Mesopotamian society. The importance of the river floods. Although the rivers supported agriculture, their floods could sometimes be unpredictable. When heavy rains or melting snow from distant mountains caused the rivers to rise, water could spread across nearby land. These floods sometimes damaged homes and fields. However, they also carried fertile mud that enriched the soil. After the water receded, farmers often found that their fields became more productive. Because of this, people in Mesopotamia both feared and respected the rivers. Managing water through irrigation canals helped reduce the dangers while still benefiting from the fertile soil left behind by the floods. Life beyond the city walls. Outside the walls of Mesopotamian cities, the countryside stretched across wide open plains. Small villages and farms dotted the landscape. Here, farmers worked fields and cared for animals such as sheep, goats, and cattle. Dusty roads connected these villages to nearby cities where goods could be traded in the markets. Travelers moving between cities often passed through these rural areas. Although the cities were centers of government and trade, much of the population still lived and worked in the surrounding countryside. These rural communities helped supply the food that allowed the cities to grow and prosper. A peaceful evening in Mesopotamia. As evening spreads across the plains, the heat of the day begins to fade. Farmers return from the fields and merchants close their stalls in the marketplace. The city grows quieter as families gather inside their homes. Clay lamps glow softly, lighting small rooms where people share food and conversation. Outside, the rivers continue their slow journey through the land. The great ziggurat rises above the rooftops, watching over the sleeping city. For a few peaceful hours, the ancient land of Mesopotamia rests beneath the calm night sky. The role of temple workers. The temples of Mesopotamia were not only places of worship, but also centers of daily activity. Many workers were employed within the temple complexes. Some were priests responsible for performing rituals and ceremonies meant to honor the gods. Others worked as administrators who managed temple land, food supplies, and records. Temple workers often supervised fields that belonged to the temple itself. Farmers working these lands would bring part of their harvest to the temple as offerings or taxes. Large storage rooms inside the temple complex held grain, oil, and other supplies. Because of these responsibilities, temples became powerful institutions within Mesopotamian cities. They played a major role in both religious and economic life. The work of boat builders. Because the rivers were so important for travel and trade, skilled workers known as boat builders were needed to construct and repair vessels. These craftsmen used wood, reeds, and bitumen, a natural sticky substance found in the region. Reeds were sometimes bundled together to form lightweight boats used for fishing or short trips. Larger wooden boats were built for transporting goods between cities. Bitumen helped seal the boats and keep water from leaking through the seams. Boat builders carefully shaped each vessel to ensure it could move safely along the rivers. Without these boats, trade along the Tigris and Euphrates would have been far more difficult. Music and Mesopotamian life. Music was an important part of many Mesopotamian ceremonies and gatherings. Musicians played instruments such as harps, lyres, flutes, and drums. These instruments were often used during festivals, religious rituals, and celebrations. Some musicians performed inside temples during important ceremonies. Others entertained guests during gatherings or community events. The sounds of music helped mark important moments in the lives of the people. Through music, stories and traditions were shared across generations. The city gates. The gates of Mesopotamian cities were important points of entry and exit. Large walls surrounded many cities, and the gates controlled who could pass through. Guards were stationed near these entrances to watch travelers arriving from the countryside. Merchants entering the city often carried goods loaded onto donkeys or carts. Visitors sometimes came seeking trade, work, or news from distant places. Throughout the day, the city gates remained busy with people moving in and out. But as evening approached, activity slowed and the gates became quieter. The quiet before dawn. Late in the night, the city becomes almost completely silent. The lamps inside homes slowly burn low. Most people sleep after long days of work in fields, markets, and workshops. Only a few guards remain awake near the temples or city gates. The rivers continue flowing steadily through the dark plains. Soon the first hint of light will appear along the horizon. When morning returns, the people of Mesopotamia will once again begin their daily routines. The work of traders on the rivers. The rivers of Mesopotamia allowed traders to move goods more easily than traveling across the dry plains. Large wooden boats carried cargoes such as grain, pottery, cloth, and metal tools. These boats drifted along the slow currents of the Tigris and Euphrates, connecting cities that were many miles apart. Boat crews worked together to guide the vessels and protect the goods during the journey. When the boats reached a city, merchants unloaded the cargo at docks along the riverbanks. From there, the goods were carried into marketplaces where they could be sold or traded. Through these river journeys, cities across Mesopotamia remained connected and supplied with valuable resources. The work of farmers at harvest. Harvest season was one of the busiest times of the year for Mesopotamian farmers. After months of tending their crops, the fields were finally ready to be gathered. Farmers cut barley and wheat using simple tools such as sickles. Bundles of grain were collected and carried back to storage areas. These harvests were essential for feeding both villages and cities throughout the year. Some of the grain was kept for family use, while other portions were given as taxes or offerings to temples and rulers. A successful harvest meant security and food for the coming months. Because of this, harvest season was often a time of both hard work and relief. The sounds of the city. During the daytime, Mesopotamian cities were filled with many different sounds. Merchants called out to customers in the marketplace. Potters worked their wheels while craftsmen hammered tools in their workshops. Donkeys carrying goods moved slowly through narrow streets. Children played near their homes while adults discussed trade and daily tasks. These sounds blended together into the steady rhythm of city life. But as evening arrived, the noise slowly faded. The once busy streets became quiet as families returned home. The calm of the ancient world. As night settles across Mesopotamia, the land grows still. The rivers continue their quiet flow through the dark plains. The great ziggurat towers above the sleeping city, its shape outlined by faint starlight. Inside mud-brick homes, families rest after long days of work. The markets are empty, and the city gates stand silent. For a few peaceful hours, the ancient world rests beneath the calm night sky. Soon the sun will rise again over the rivers and fields, and life in Mesopotamia will begin another day. The work of reed gatherers. Along the edges of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, tall reeds grew in thick clusters. These plants were more than just part of the landscape. They were an important resource for the people living nearby. Workers traveled to the riverbanks to gather bundles of these reeds. Once cut, the reeds could be dried and used for many purposes. Some were woven into baskets and mats used inside homes. Others were tied together to form small boats that floated along the rivers. Reeds were also used in roofing and walls for simple structures. Because they grew quickly along the water, they provided a steady supply of useful material for the surrounding communities. The work of fishermen at dawn. Long before the marketplaces filled with activity, fishermen often began their work. As the first light appeared over the rivers, small boats drifted quietly across the water. Fishermen lowered nets into the current and waited patiently. The rivers were rich with fish, providing an important source of food for the cities nearby. Once the nets were pulled back in, the catch was sorted and placed into baskets. Some fish were taken directly to the marketplaces where they could be sold fresh. Others were dried in the sun so they could be stored for longer periods. The quiet work of fishermen became part of the early morning rhythm along the rivers. The life of palace workers. In larger Mesopotamian cities, palaces served as centers of government. These buildings were home to rulers, officials, and many workers who helped manage the affairs of the city. Palace workers carried out a variety of tasks. Some recorded information on clay tablets, tracking supplies and trade. Others managed storerooms filled with grain, oil, and valuable goods. Servants prepared meals, cleaned rooms, and maintained the large buildings. Guards stood watch at entrances and along palace walls. Although the palace might appear calm from the outside, inside it was often busy with activity as workers helped support the administration of the city. The movement of caravans. Beyond the rivers and cities, the wide plains of Mesopotamia were crossed by traveling caravans. Merchants guided long lines of donkeys carrying goods across dusty paths. These caravans connected cities with distant regions where valuable materials could be obtained. Traveling merchants sometimes brought copper, stone, timber, and other rare resources. In return, Mesopotamian cities exported grain, textiles, pottery, and crafted goods. These journeys were slow and often required careful planning. But over time, these trade routes helped build connections between many early civilizations. Quiet moments in the courtyards. Inside many Mesopotamian homes, a central courtyard provided a peaceful place away from the busy streets. These open spaces allowed sunlight and fresh air to enter the home. During the heat of the day, family members sometimes rested in the shade of the courtyard walls. Children played nearby while adults prepared food or completed small tasks. Clay jars filled with water were kept cool in the shade. These quiet courtyards created a calm space within the crowded cities. They offered moments of rest between the many responsibilities of daily life. The slow return of morning. Eventually the long night begins to fade. The sky over the plains slowly lightens as the first hint of dawn appears. Birds stir among the reeds along the rivers. Fishermen prepare their boats while farmers begin walking toward their fields. Inside the city, lamps burn low as people wake to begin another day. The great rivers continue their steady flow through the land. And once again, life in ancient Mesopotamia quietly begins anew. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring the world of ancient Mesopotamia. From the flowing rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates to the busy marketplaces, farms, and temples, life in this early civilization followed a steady rhythm shaped by the land and the people who lived there. These ancient cities, built from clay and shaped by the work of farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and scribes, became some of the first great centers of human civilization. Though thousands of years have passed, the rivers still flow through the same plains where these early communities once lived and worked. If you enjoyed this peaceful journey through history, consider subscribing to Dreamtime History for more calm explorations of the past designed to help you relax and fall asleep. For now, rest well. And thank you for listening.